Jackson's Stables by Ron Ripley. The temperature had plummeted beneath the combined assault of rain and the sunset. Neil's thin sweatshirt was soaked through, and each drop of rain felt like a needle as it struck his exposed skin. He shuddered and pulled his baseball cap down lower, water dripping from the brim. He desperately wanted to hitch a ride with someone, but he hadn't seen a car since he had left Litchfield, New Hampshire. It was as though everyone had known the storm was coming and they had hunkered down to wait it out. Neil didn't have that option. He had been on the move for a week, moving south in an effort to get out of New England before winter hit. His whole goal was to reach Washington, D.C. before autumn, and at first, he had thought that he had a good chance of doing that. But a week in Valley Street Jail in Manchester, New Hampshire had destroyed that possibility. He had been forced to find a flophouse for a week, renting a foul little room in Nashua and sharing a bathroom with everyone else on the floor so he wouldn't miss his court date. And all because you had to fight a guy at St. Anselm's College, Neil thought bitterly. He had been drunk, of course, and the younger man's derisive comment about the Yankees baseball cap Neil favored had been unacceptable. Campus security had pulled him off the student, and Manchester police had taken care of the rest. I shouldn't be leaving the state, Neil thought, trying to warm himself. I'm just going to get picked up somewhere and sent back here for parole violation. He shook his head and refused to think about it anymore. Too cold, he thought. Too damn cold. Need a place to sleep. Get warm. For the first time since the storm had begun, Neil stopped and looked around. 100 or so feet ahead he saw a small road that branched off to the left, and there was a sign hanging haphazardly from an old granite post. Neil squinted and was able to read the faded words. Jackson's Stables. Between the words was the silhouette of a horse's head. Neil walked forward, speeding up. When he reached the turnoff, he saw how the underbrush had grown up around either side of the road and begun to spread across it. A sure sign that no one had traveled along this road for quite some time. Neil hesitated, then turned onto the road. The branches of the trees on either side of the road formed a tangled canopy above him, and the rainfall was noticeably weaker. Maybe there's a house, he thought, shivering. Just someplace to rest. The sound of his feet on the old pavement was muffled as the trees and undergrowth became thicker. A glance down showed the asphalt was broken and crumbling on the sides with great cracks running along the center and perpendicular to the trees. Neil paused, shifted his backpack to sit so it didn't rub his lower back raw through the wet sweatshirt, and then continued along the road. He felt the road rise slowly beneath him as the darkness thickened. Above him, he heard the rain striking the leaves, and while his momentum slackened due to his poor night vision, Neil felt comfortable. Even if there's no place at the end of this road, he thought, I'll rest here. This isn't too bad. Satisfied with his decision, Neil hastened along the asphalt, slowing down only when he reached the crest of the small rise and the trees fell away, leaving a wide, open field in front of him. In the distance, he thought he saw a large structure, and a moment later lightning flickered and illuminated the landscape. Neil blinked, the image emblazoned upon the inside of his eyelids for a moment as he began to count. 1 1,000, 2 1,000, 3 1,000, and halfway through 4, he was interrupted by a thunderous roar that ripped through the air. There had been a house. A monstrous building at the end of the road, and even in the storm he had been able to see how far away the structure was. Probably a quarter mile, he thought, adjusting the straps on his shoulders again. Across open ground. In a lightning storm. Neil glanced back at the dark road he had traversed and decided to make a go of it. The place is dark, he thought. There's got to be a way in, and that sure beats staying out here. With his decision made, he put his head down and forced his tired legs to jog. Within a minute, his lungs complained, too many years of smoking having done their work on his ability to breathe easily. But he kept the idea of warmth and safety foremost in his mind and did his best to ignore the pain in his chest and the rasping sound he made as he breathed. Several minutes passed, and a few more lightning strikes cut through the sky, each one closer to him. He concentrated on the thunder, on counting the time between the noise and the light. By the time he reached the building, Neil was gasping for breath, and there had been less than 2 seconds separating the thunder from the lightning. His first impression of the structure left him ecstatic. The second caused his hopes to crash. He had stumbled upon an old farmhouse, a large, rambling creation that had seen better days. Evidence of a fire was clear, even in the near darkness. The faded white siding was streaked with black from each window, and where the roof should have been, Neil saw only exposed rafters, each one protruding into the sky like a skeletal finger. Reluctant to give up the idea of sanctuary so easily, he stepped up to a broken window, then peeled aside and gagged. The house was rank with the stench of death. Something, or someone, had died inside, and the body still rotted within. Maybe a shed. A garage? He thought. Then he straightened up and stepped further away, a small smile playing across his face. Stables. They had horses. A desperate hope filled him as he hurried around the right side of the building. Maybe the fire didn't spread to the stables, he thought. And when he turned the corner, Neil almost shouted out with joy. Across a muddy and weed-strewn yard stood a stone and wood stable, and the roof was intact. Neil ran to the open door and stepped out of the rain for the first time in hours. The stables smelled of old hay and oats, horse and leather, and it was warm and dry. Neil took his lighter out of his pocket, lit it and held it aloft, the small flame casting a surprising amount of light. A full dozen stalls, stretched out to either side, all of their doors closed and ancient tack hanging on hooks outside of each. Saddles, equally old, hung over each door, and at the far left was a small tack room. Neil advanced on the tack room, not bothering to look in the old stalls. When he reached the room, he found the door open, the room bare of any sort of equipment other than a small kerosene lantern hanging from a hook. He took the lantern down and gave it a slight shake. Liquid sloshed inside, and he let out a surprised laugh. Sitting down on the floor, he raised the chimney on the lantern, adjusted the wick, and lit it with his lighter. A moment later a bright, clean light filled the room, and he lowered the chimney back into place. "And let there be light," he murmured to himself. Turning around, Neil closed the door, saw it had a lock and secured it. He shivered and held the lantern aloft. For the first time, he noticed a small bench built into the far wall beneath a window covered with an old bit of fabric. Crawling forward, he saw the hinges on the bench's top, and when he pushed up on the lip of it, the bench opened. A few spiders scrambled away from the light and the sudden disturbance of their home, but they didn't bother him. His attention was fixed on the thick horse blankets folded neatly at the bottom of the bench. This is just too good, Neil thought. He set the lantern down and removed 3 blankets. They were made of wool, heavy, and with more holes than was good for them. But taken as a whole, they would keep him warm. Neil quickly shrugged off his backpack and opened it, removing a plastic bag that contained his only other set of clothes, the traveling meal he had gotten from a shelter, and his only pack of cigarettes. He set them neatly on the floor, then stripped down, his teeth chattering, his entire body shaking as he hastily wrapped himself in the blankets and let the wool warm him up. A gentle heat was thrown from the kerosene lamp, and after a few minutes, his shaking subsided. The thunder cracked overhead, and the walls of the stable shook, but Neil grinned. He was inside. Humming, he opened his food and quickly ate it. When he finished, he spread his wet clothes out on the bench to dry, and curled up in the blankets, resting his head on his backpack. While the wool was rough against his bare skin, it wasn't enough to keep his exhaustion from dragging him down toward sleep. He felt himself drifting away, hoping that the rain would be done when the morning arrived. A soft neigh caused his eyes to pop open. Neil lay perfectly still, listening. The sound wasn't repeated. Outside of the stables, he heard the wind as it increased. The thunder roared again, but it was farther away. I'm tired, Neil thought, closing his eyes. Sleep in a stable. Smell the horses. Think I hear the horses. Nothing more than that. He relaxed at the thought and yawned as he made himself comfortable on the floor. The light of the kerosene lantern was bright, but he hated to put out the flame. He enjoyed the small amount of warmth it provided, and there it reassured him that he had not, in fact, left civilization behind completely. In the morning I'll get on the road again, he thought. I should be able to catch a ride. At least into Nashua. Maybe even over the Massachusetts border. Another noise filled the silence, and Neil had no choice but to remain immobile. Fear kept his body frozen in place. As a child, Neil's grandparents had been horse people. They had owned a few mares, horses put out to pasture before Neil had been born. But those horses, and others that followed, were a part of his childhood. He knew how to rub the animals down and to make friends with them, to get them to do what he wanted without resorting to force. And he knew that while the wind might sound like a neigh as it coursed through an old building, it would never sound like hooves dragged across the floor of a stall. Neil knew there weren't any horses in the stable. There was a distinct difference between the smell of a recently used stable and that of one which had been defunct for years. The stable he was in had been empty. Perhaps for 20 or 30 years. Which was why the sound of hooves frightened him. He managed to break free of the fear, reached a hand out and turned the wick down on the lantern. The light in the tack room dimmed accordingly, and Neil waited and listened. There was a chance, however slim, that someone might use the stable to get their horse out of the rain. If that was the case, then Neil would have to wait them out. And while he didn't particularly care for such a scenario, it wouldn't be the first time. Neil didn't move as he lay on the floor. Didn't so much as twitch a finger. His ears strained for any additional sounds that might be audible over the pulse of his blood. Silence. He breathed slowly, counting each inhalation until he reached 50, and he still hadn't heard another scraping hoof or soft neigh. I'm hearing things, he thought, closing his eyes. I'm tired. I might even have a fever, which wouldn't surprise me, not with me being out in that storm for so long. Try to find a hospital tomorrow, if I'm still hearing stuff. It took him several minutes to relax, and when he finally did, it took even longer for his need to sleep to overcome his alert state. Neil drifted off, content and warm in his small nest of rough comfort, and he dreamt of a soft bed and his mother. He had seen neither of them in over a decade, not since he had turned 25. The sound of feet on the floor outside of the tack room door yanked Neil out of his dreams. He listened, and a moment later he heard the sound again. His eyes fixated on the door and fear built itself slowly and steadily in his system. The old porcelain doorknob turned first to the right, then back to the left. There was a strained groan as the wood pressed against the doorframe, but the old lock was secure, and the door didn't open. The doorknob returned to its place, the dull gleam of the kerosene's light shining in the pale white porcelain. Then the entire door shook as someone tried to force it open. Neil clamped his jaw together tightly, refusing to utter a single sound. Go away, he thought desperately, just go away. There's nothing here. Only me, and I'm not worth your trouble. The walls rattled with the force behind the unseen person's attempt to enter the room. Neil pushed himself into a sitting position and reached for his dry clothes. As soon as his hand touched his pants, the person on the other side stopped their efforts to get in. A heartbeat later, footsteps stomped away, and Neil heard an undeniably male voice muttering curses as he went. Neil glanced at the window, saw that it was large enough for him to get out of, and decided it was time to get dressed. Even if the stranger didn't come back and try the door again, with a crowbar or some other tool, Neil would sleep better knowing that he was ready to escape. He dressed quickly and quietly, and when he finished, he put his wet clothes into his backpack. The only article of clothing he didn't slip on was his boots. They were soaked through, and he hated the sensation of wet feet. His new socks were dry, and he wanted to keep them that way for as long as possible. At least the door held, Neil thought, wrapping up in the blankets again. It'll take a little more than rattling the doorknob and pushing to get in. Which is good to know. That slight reassurance helped him relax, but he knew it wouldn't be enough to enable him to fall back asleep. Not fully. Cocooned in the horse blankets, Neil propped himself against the far wall with his backpack on the bench top and his wet boots beside him. If the stranger returned and tried to gain access to the room, Neil could be up and out long before the door ever gave way. A sense of satisfaction filled him, and Neil even dared to turn up the kerosene lantern. Beyond the thick walls of the stables, the thunderstorm continued to rage, the rain slamming into the glass of the window. He allowed himself to relax, although as suspected he couldn't fall back asleep. It's all right, he thought. I've gotten by on less. His thoughts were interrupted by the sharp strike of hooves on the floor. Neil tilted his head and listened. The hoof beats were too many, some overlapping others, for a single horse to make in the confines of the stable. Damn, is someone using this place to keep their stock? He wondered. It wouldn't surprise him. Land for horses was at a premium, and the stable was in excellent condition. A little maintenance would go a long way. But as he listened, Neil realized he couldn't hear any of the stalls open. And even if the hinges were oiled on a regular basis, at least one or two of them should have made some noise. The set of hooves stopped in front of the tack room, the horse on the other side of the wood snorted. A hoof scraped against the floor several times, and as Neil listened, curious as to why the horse was there, he learned the answer. Something struck the door, the blow sounding like the crack of a cannon. The wood split down the middle with chunks of the door spinning out into the room while the entire door sagged in the frame. For a moment, Neil was paralyzed, unable to move from the sheer shock of the blow. But when the second one knocked the door off the hinges, he scrambled to his feet. Without bothering to grab his boots or his backpack, with his heart thundering in his chest, Neil threw open the window and scrambled out of it, and back into the storm. He let out a low cry as he landed on his left shoulder, feeling the sharp and unmistakable sensation of his clavicle breaking. Trying not to regurgitate his meager meal, Neil panted as he got to his feet, the rain and mud seeping instantly through his thin socks. The rain lashed at his face while the wind howled through the ruins of the farmhouse. Lightning struck nearby and illuminated the yard. Neil's breath caught in his throat as he glanced around, his mind unable to accept the images his eyes gazed upon. 5 horses stood in the yard around him, their eyes fixed on him. They stood utterly still, and while his own exhalations crept out of his mouth and nose in white tendrils, nothing of the sort escaped from the horses. Lightning flashed, and a moment later, a peal of thunder shook the earth. When it did, he struggled to accept the sight lightning had revealed. He had been able to see through the horses as if they weren't there. And as if to reinforce the image, he had seen that all the horses were dry. Their manes were perfectly combed and elegant, their tails as well. Each hoof gleamed, and their eyes showed a disturbing level of intelligence. The horses were dark-colored, each a deep chestnut as if they had all been sired by the same stallion upon the same mare. And they were tall, easily the tallest Neil had seen. He found himself wondering how difficult it had been to break them to the saddle. The thought vanished as quickly as it had arrived, and he focused on the animals. He knew that the lightning strikes were playing tricks on his eyes. It was an impossibility, seeing through them. Whatever horse had been in the stable had been real enough to destroy the tack room door, and Neil had no doubt that the creatures could do the same to him, should they choose to. He glanced at the broken window and the wrecked frame, and shards of glass served as a reminder to his body of the injuries it had sustained. His stomach rolled at the intensity of the pain from his broken bone, and among the cold rivulets of water from the rain, Neil felt the warmer flow of blood. The glass had cut him on the way through the window. With his good arm, Neil wiped water off his face and wished for his hat and belongings. Later, he told himself. Come back for them later. Something's wrong here. He nodded at his own advice and took a cautious step toward the dirt driveway that led out of the yard. The horses moved with him. He tried a quicker step and the horses cantered towards him. When he stopped, so did they. Neil glanced over his shoulder at the ruined farmhouse and wondered if he could make it to the safety of the structure before the horses overtook him. One of the horses pawed at the earth, and while the hoof seemed incapable of churning the soft mud and dead grass, Neil had no doubt as to what would come next. His decision had been made for him. He turned on his heel and sprinted for the farmhouse, a flash of lightning showing him a small back door at the building center. The horses let out a simultaneous, horrific scream, and charged after him. Neil panicked as he reached the house, trying to pull open a door that needed to be pushed. Realizing his mistake, he gave the door a shove and tumbled in as it sprang open and slammed against the interior wall. The foul, putrid odor that had forced him into the stable to begin with, slammed into him, but Neil ignored it, plunging deeper into the darkness of the house. Behind him, the horses continued to scream, their voices raised in a disturbing mimicry of a human's. He heard their hooves striking the walls, felt the house shake, and he let out a shriek of fear as he tripped over some unseen item in the darkness. When he struck the floor, Neil threw up from the pain in his shoulder, feeling the ends of the broken clavicle grind against one another. He tried to get up, but his hands slipped in his own vomit, and he fell again. The horses continued their assault on the house, and rather than try a second time to stand up, Neil crawled forward. Every movement was a symphony of pain, his head throbbing in time to the erratic beating of his heart. His body screamed for him to stop, and despite the adrenaline pumping through him, Neil felt the sharp bite of glass still embedded in him from his escape through the window. Panting, he was dimly aware of the floor beneath him. It was smooth in places, rough in others, as if some madman had taken a handplane and worked the floor over in various spots. There was no rhyme or reason to the pattern, and Neil found that particularly disturbing. When the sounds of the horses faded to a dull roar in the background, Neil allowed himself to relax. He rolled over onto his back, sobbing at the pain in his shoulder while staring into the darkness above him. There was a complete and utter lack of light in the house, even when the lightning flashed. What the hell is going on? He asked himself, his breath hitching in his throat. Am I dreaming? His body answered that question for him. He was in far too much pain for it to be a dream. Neil tried to calm down, but he barely succeeded in his effort to regulate his breathing. Finally, after an indefinite period, he sat up. With his good hand, he reached out and tried to find the wall. When he did, he recoiled, for the wall had been damp to the touch. No, Neil thought, extending his hand again and wincing at the sensation of the wall beneath his fingers. It's sticky. Like it's weeping glue. He had a mental image of old wallpaper, the material hanging and peeling in long, ragged strips. Neil wiped his hand on his pants leg and forced himself to think. There has to be a way out of here, he thought. And probably straight ahead. Most old houses are like that. A hall that runs front to back. That's probably what I'm in. The hallway. Following that line of thinking, Neil relaxed a little more. As he did so, he felt his muscles cramp up, and for the first time, he realized his feet hurt. Warily, he reached down and probed the wet sock of each foot and gasped as he discovered rough tacks piercing the fabric. Clenching his teeth, he pulled one tack out, and he squeezed his eyes against the pane until stars and checkered patterns reminiscent of an Escher painting played across the backs of his eyelids. His breath came in shuddering gasps as he rolled the tack around in his hand. It was short and sharp, and roughly squared. An upholstery tack, he thought. Trying to remember when he had last received a tetanus shot, Neil extracted the remaining tacks, counting 9 altogether. Okay, he thought, behind me is the way out. Ahead of me is the way I came in, and the horses are there too. There was a person with them before. Someone who tried to get into the tack room. Neil listened and realized the horses no longer made any noise. Neither did the house shake from their blows. They're all back in the stable, he told himself. They chased me away. More than likely, the guy who brought them is in the tack room, sorting through my stuff and realizing I didn't have anything. He'll put the horses in their stalls and take off. Probably some hick who drove his pickup down a back road. I just need to wait until I hear the damn thing start up and leave. Then I'll be able to get out. Satisfied with his decision, Neil adjusted his injured arm as best he could and waited. He had no way to judge the passage of time, but he heard the thunder fade away, then the rain slowed and came to a stop. From where he sat in the hallway, Neil listened to water drip down from the top floors. As his adrenaline rush faded, exhaustion swept over him, but he knew he couldn't fall asleep. Not again. If he didn't hear the person leave, then he wasn't safe in the house. Neil would have to try and make it out through the front, where the smell was the strongest. Finally, unable to wait any longer, he managed to stand up. He forced himself to touch the repulsive wall and use it as a guide. Each step was an agony, pain shooting up through the soles of his feet, the broken clavicle a horror to suffer through. The wounds from the glass, which had formed thin scabs, reopened and bled freely. Neil felt himself growing dizzy and weak from the combination of fear and blood loss. But as he traveled further into the house, the interior took on definition. Light seeped in from somewhere, and he was able to see that the walls were not wallpapered, but paneled. A mucus covered them as if some giant slug had spent the evening creeping over every inch of wood. Through the gloom, Neil spotted the front door and a long stairwell that led to the second floor. From a window through a doorway, he saw it was the moonlight that offered the small shred of illumination. Neil paused and looked into the room, seeing the broken and abandoned furniture. It took him a moment to realize that the room's window was the same that he had approached when he had first found the house. Instantly his eyes peered through the gloom, seeking out the source of the stench, and stumbling backward when he found it. The rotting corpse of a person lay sprawled across an antique fainting couch. In the soft light of the room, Neil noticed that the body wore the same battered jeans and faded green sweatshirt that he had on. And like himself, there were no shoes. Only a pair of socks on the narrow feet. Neil glanced down at his own feet, then back at the corpse. In the grim, sunken features of the body, he realized he was looking upon himself. The high cheekbones, black hair. And Neil knew that if he crossed the room and looked at the right forearm, he would see the faded tattoo of a panther he had gotten as a teen. That's me, he realized, horrified. I'm dead. I died here. Panic welled up within him. Neil stood and stared, unable to tear his gaze away from the terrifying sight of his own rotting flesh in front of him. He went into the stable, a voice whispered, and Neil screamed. Without looking for the speaker, Neil ran on his damaged feet. He didn't slow down for the door either, slamming into it with his good right shoulder and driving the door and its hinges through the rotted wood of the frame. Neil staggered into the front yard, tripped over the door and nearly fell. But he managed to keep himself upright, twisting around to see the speaker. A small man stood in the doorway. He was wizened and ancient. Thin gray strands of hair hung down in greasy clumps to his shoulders, his clothes nothing more than tattered rags that accentuated the thinness of his frame. His face was pinched, his eyes shining in the depths of his sockets. He tilted his head with the same interest as a crow might show a curious piece of roadkill. "Listen," Neil said, his voice hoarse, "I'm sorry. I just want my stuff, and I'll take off, okay?" "He went into the stable," the old man repeated. "Sure. Whatever," Neil said, licking his lips nervously. "Like I said, I just want my stuff." "He shouldn't have," the old man said. "Yeah. I figured that out," Neil replied. "So, what do you say?" "They don't like anyone in their stable." The old man turned around and disappeared into the house. Before Neil could ask who, he had his answer. A loud, brutal neigh filled the night air, and a heavy force slammed into the small of his back. Neil shrieked as he was thrown onto the wet grass. He was face down and awash in pain. His legs refused to respond to his desperate attempts to stand, and a slow, numbing sensation spread out through his arms. Frantic, he tried to dig his fingers into the soft earth, but he felt a hand on his shoulder. Neil screamed when he was flipped onto his back, and again when he saw the old man standing over him. In the periphery of his vision, Neil saw the horses, all of them watching him and waiting. "He went into the stable," the old man said, staring at Neil. "They didn't like it." Neil wanted to respond, but the pain was too intense. "You went into the stable," the stranger continued. "They didn't like that either." The old man lifted up a small sledgehammer. "Try again." "No," Neil whispered. And the old man brought the tool crashing down. Next story. Music Box by A.I. Nasser. I hated the music box the minute I laid eyes upon it. It was a Christmas present. Or at least I think it was. I never could remember what the occasion had been, but I remember feeling disappointed. I remember ripping through layer upon layer of awkwardly taped red wrapping paper, shaking the box that encased it, praying that it was the blue Power Ranger I had been nagging my parents about for months. I also remember the smile on my grandfather's face as he watched me open the box, and the sudden silence that fell when I finally saw what was inside. "It's handmade, Johnny," my grandfather cried out, clapping his hands and rubbing them together, obviously a lot more excited about the present than I was. "It took me a while, but I got it done on time, yes I did." I couldn't stop staring at the small box. It was clear that my grandfather had gone through a great deal of trouble to get it done. With trembling fingers, I ran my hands across the smooth wood and traced the initials he had carved into it, JKA. Part of me wanted to break into tears, because even then, I knew that a music box was not one of the coolest things a 12-year-old could get. My father coughed, and I grudgingly looked up at him as he sat in his rocking chair, pipe in hand, dark eyes staring gravely at me. I could feel what he wanted to say just by looking at him. I could see it on his face, the constant lecture he gave me and my brother, Kevin, about how a man's character is defined by key moments in life. "And this is one of those moments, Johnny," his eyes said. I looked at my grandfather and gave him a weak smile. "It's awesome." I lied, holding it up for him to see and shaking it carefully. My grandfather chuckled and slid off the couch, settling on his knees beside me. "You are going to love this, my boy," he said, taking the music box out of my hands. "You don't even have to wind it up." I watched him roll it around before finally flipping the lid open. A small wolf was at the center of a turning disc, carved in wood, howling at some non-existent moon. It began to turn, silently at first, before the music accompanied it. "Dad, what is that?" I heard my mother ask from behind me. I didn't need to ask her what she was talking about. I knew what was bothering her, what was driving nails into my skull and scratching at the inside of my eyes. The music. It was the music that turned my initial hatred towards the box into complete loathing. And it took every inch of willpower not to snatch my grandfather's present and toss into the fireplace where it belonged. "I think it's cool," Kevin said that night. We were lying in bed, the moonlight finding its way through the partially drawn curtains, shedding a silver glow on the floorboards between us. There was a light breeze outside that ruffled the big oak planted right beside our house, and the branches swayed and danced, giving us a mesmerizing shadow play. My brother and I often stayed up late watching the dancing shadows, giggling as quietly as possible so as not to wake my parents while we let our imaginations make up stories to the swaying images. It was a game we played often. But not tonight. Tonight we were content with just lying in bed, unable to sleep, too tired to do anything else. "What is?" I asked. I heard a ruffle of movement as my brother turned in his bed. "The music box," he said. "That wolf is really cool." I didn't answer. In my head, the wolf didn't matter. It was still a music box. Which meant that I was going to put it in the back of my toy box and forget all about it. Sure, there would be times when I'd take it out, find a special place for it on my bookshelf when my grandfather came to visit, just so he wouldn't be upset. But in my mind, I didn't want to have anything to do with it. "Can you imagine what the kids at school would say?" Kevin chirped. "I'm not going to take it to school," I replied. "What?" I almost laughed at the clear shock in my brother's voice, mixed with just a little bit of disappointment. A couple of months ago, he had caught a ladybug in a jar and had taken it to show and tell, earning him a gamut of mockery from the other kids in class. I wasn't surprised that the music box excited him. "How could you not?" Kevin demanded, trying to keep his voice as hushed as possible in the midst of his outburst. "The guys would go crazy over that." "Did you see the wolf?" "Of course I saw the wolf," I replied. "It's not as cool as you think. Now go to sleep, already." Spring squeaked as Kevin dropped back into bed, huffing in frustration, obviously angry at how his big brother wasn't taking the music box seriously. I usually found moments like this amusing, especially with that pout on his face that made him look like a duck. But tonight it was annoying. "If you like it so much, you keep it," I said, turning onto my side and giving him my back. "Really?" The bed squeaked again. "Yes, really," I mocked. "Take it to school yourself. See how the kids make fun of you." There was a long silence, during which I was certain Kevin was contemplating this new turn in events. I had just opened up an opportunity for him that he had probably not thought of before. He would ignore my warnings completely. "No backsies." "No," I said. "Now go to sleep." "Can I see it?" I turned to look at him, sitting cross-legged in his bed, the shadow dance on the floor making it seem like we were in two separate boats divided by a silver river. The smile on his face was almost cute if I hadn't been annoyed by his insistence. "In the morning," I said. "But you said I can have it," Kevin argued. "So, it's mine now. You can't tell me when to see it." "It's yours when I give it to you," I replied. "Johnny, please." "Fine," I hissed, turning around again and drawing the covers over my head. "But if Dad comes in here yelling, I'm saying it was your fault." I heard the spring squeak again and the familiar sound of Kevin's little feet scurrying across the hardwood floor. I closed my eyes, listening as he rummaged through my toy box for a few minutes before sitting down with a dull thump. Then there was only silence. I turned around, frowning, lifting myself up just enough so that I could see him from over the edge of the bed. Kevin sat in the space between the closet and the foot of his bed, barely visible in the shadows, staring at the music box he held in his hands. I watched him quietly, waiting for him to open it, but he just sat there. It made me uneasy. "Kevin." "It's beautiful," Kevin said softly, turning it around in his hands. It wasn't what he said so much as how he said it that made me shudder, just a little. I felt the temperature in the room drop slightly, and my hands curled around the edges of my blanket, pulling the covers closer. Kevin, maybe we should just wait until tomorrow. But he didn't listen. He set the music box down on the floor in front of him and flipped it open. I don't know if it was the dancing shadows or the way Kevin just stared at the damn thing, but the moment the music began to play, my body began to shiver uncontrollably. I wasn't imagining the cold anymore, either. It seeped under the covers and crept into my pajamas, sliding up and down my limbs like cold fingers leaving trails across my skin. The air grew heavier, too, and my breaths came in short gasps as if something were pressing down on my chest and preventing me from breathing. Kevin. It's so beautiful, isn't it, Johnny? Kevin asked, finally looking up at me. My heart jumped in my chest, and the cold fingers trailing across my body suddenly felt like claws that dug deep into my skin. Kevin stared at me with eyes that had turned a deep amber, and the smile on his face did not reflect the amused merriment of a 9-year-old who had just gotten a new toy. No. It was sinister, conniving, a smile that promised dark secrets that, if told, would drive a man insane. Isn't it, Johnny? Kevin repeated, and this time his voice carried a harsh pitch that scratched painfully at the insides of my skull. The music coming from the box only made it worse. Close it, Kevin. I said, cringing from the music's onslaught. My mind was screaming for mercy, demanding that I jump out of bed and run out of the room. Now. Quickly. Let's make music together, Johnny, Kevin hissed, his voice deeper now, foreign to my ears. He began to chuckle. Let's make music. Let's make music. Let's make music. His screams rocked through the room so violently I was certain it would shatter the windows and shower me in glass. I screamed in return, feeling those cold hands latch onto my spine and twist, forcing me to arch my back violently under the entanglement of the sheets. The music coming from the box rose to a high crescendo that pierced my ears, making the pain in my head even more unbearable. My hands balled into fists and my nails dug into the palms of my hands. And just when I thought I couldn't take any more, when the agony coursing through my body threatened to rip me apart, the door to our bedroom flew open and my father stormed in. What the hell is going on here? His voice was a muffled bellowing in the midst of the ringing in my head. The cold hands that had held me withdrew immediately, and my body flopped down onto the bed. The music stopped and the pounding in my head slowly began to dissipate. The lights in the room came on, and my eyes fluttered open to see my father standing at the threshold of our bedroom door, enraged. His eyes darted between me and Kevin before finally resting on the music box. "What are you two doing?" my father shouted, grabbing Kevin by the arm and hauling him to his feet. "Do you know what time it is?" I tried to answer him, but my head reeled, and the world around me continued to spin out of control. "This is ridiculous, you two." My vision blurred as I watched my father toss Kevin onto his bed. "We're going to have a long talk tomorrow, you and I. Now go to sleep." He pointed an angry finger at him, then turned to me. "Both of you." I nodded weakly. My eyes darted to where Kevin grudgingly crawled under the covers, his eyes watering with tears, rubbing his arm where my father had grabbed him. "One more sound from this room, and there'll be hell to pay." My father looked at the both of us one more time before storming out, turning off the lights and slamming the door behind him. I waited for what seemed like an eternity before I turned to look at where Kevin was, his back to me, sobbing softly in the otherwise quiet room. "Are you okay?" I asked. Kevin didn't reply. I wanted to get out of bed and go to him, but the fear of my father suddenly walking back in kept me from moving. The pounding in my head was gone, and I briefly looked at the music box resting on the floor, discarded in the midst of the silver moonlight and dancing shadows. "Kevin." "Leave me alone," Kevin whispered. "Kevin, what happened?" I pushed. I said, leave me alone. I sighed and turned around, drawing the covers up tighter around me. It took an hour for me to finally fall asleep. We forgot about the music box for a few months after that night. Well, not forgot, but decided to ignore it, as though that night had never happened. It was a family habit. Maybe if we didn't speak about what bothered us, then it didn't happen. Kevin avoided me for a couple of days. After that night, and on the rare occasions when we had to be in the same room together, I could see how hurt he was that I hadn't said anything to our father that night. It was the ultimate betrayal. I was supposed to be the big brother, always there to have his back. When he finally did forgive me, I was in the backyard fixing my bike. I saw him from the corner of my eyes, rolling his own bike towards me with its flat back tire. He waited for me to fix the chain into place on my own BMX, all the time shuffling his feet and looking away when I caught him staring. "Didn't I show you how to fix that?" I asked. "I still can't do it right," Kevin replied. "I tried, but it didn't work." "So we're talking now?" Kevin shuffled his feet and looked at me, then nodded. "Here, let's take it to the garage." I abandoned my bike in the driveway and led Kevin to the garage, where we set his bike up on the small workstation my dad usually used for his projects. I half expected my brother to just prop up on a stool and watch me like he usually did, but he was quick to help with the tools, and paid close attention to everything I did. It was clear he wanted to show he was not fooling around. When I had finally patched up the hole, I lowered the bike and rolled it to one side where he could pump the tire up. "Want to go to the comic store?" I asked. "Dad gave me my allowance." "My treat." Kevin smiled. "Maybe next time," he said. "I still haven't read the one I have." I shrugged and pushed up onto the work table, swinging my legs as I sat and watched him pump the tire. "You know, I really am sorry," I said. Kevin paused for a second, and without turning around, nodded. "I didn't know what happened, Kevin," I continued. "It was so weird. Like I was dreaming or something, you know. You had these yellow eyes and..." Kevin dropped the pump and covered his face in his hands. His shoulders rose and fell as he sobbed, and I quickly slid off the table and fell on my knees beside him. I wrapped an arm around his shoulders and pressed him to me. "Hey, what's wrong?" Kevin hugged me, crying freely now. His body shook like a leaf in my arms, and I felt tears well up in my own eyes. I felt helpless. "Kevin." "It scared me, Johnny," Kevin mumbled in my shoulder. "It was so dark and scary. I couldn't see anything. And I was cold." I frowned, his words causing a chill to race through me. I looked over my shoulder at the door leading to the kitchen, contemplating whether or not to call for help, but quickly decided against it. Kevin needed me, only me, and calling either of my parents would be like breaking that trust again. "Throw it away, Johnny, please throw it away." I held my brother tighter, and my heartbeat raced when his shivering intensified. "Throw what away?" Kevin sniffed, then let out a soft moan. "The music box," he said. "Throw away the music box." I looked for it with this very intention in mind. The only thought going through my head was that of getting rid of it once and for all. I was angry, enraged actually. I hated seeing my brother cry, and I searched for the music box with a vengeance. I had even taken my father's hammer from his toolkit, already picturing myself smashing the box to pieces. It was at the back of my toy chest, cradled between a thunder cat and a smiling Mickey Mouse. I would have missed it if it hadn't been for the way the light had reflected off its polished surface. I pulled it out, tipping the toy chest over in my anger and almost tripping over the mess. I placed the box on my desk, raised the hammer, and then hesitated. Key moments, Johnny, remember? How do you know that destroying it is going to stop whatever came after Kevin? What if you just unleash it into the world? What if Kevin's eyes turn yellow again and stay like that forever? Do you really want to do that to your brother? I brought the hammer down, slowly, and rested it on the desk next to the box. I don't know how long I stood there, stoic, my eyes fixated on the music box. 10 minutes. An hour? I had no idea. All I knew was that my blind determination was probably going to cause more damage than good. I shook my head, biting my lower lip as I reached for the music box, my hand wavering slightly above it before I snatched it up. I held it close, turning it over and over, trying to wrap my mind around what to do with it. Bury it. Throw it in the river. Just don't, for heaven's sake, open it. I opened it. Several things happened at the same time the second that lid went up. The cold from that night came rushing out, as if from the box itself, and the hands that had once threatened to rip my spine in two latched onto my shoulders. Invisible claws dug into my skin, forcing my mouth open in a silent scream as a force pulled me forward. I clenched onto the box, but I couldn't feel it anymore. The disc began to spin, and as the music erupted, filling my head with its ominous tune, I could have sworn I saw the wolf turn its head towards me and smile. Then there was nothing. I opened my eyes to darkness, and a chill crawled into my skin, wrapping itself around every bone in my body. I sat up, the air around me a heavy blanket that strangled my every breath. I gasped. I choked. I coughed. And all the while, my body shook like a leaf in the wind. Somewhere in the distance, I could hear water dripping, the sound of it echoing in the darkness, its source indiscernible. I wasn't in my room anymore, I knew that for sure as I pushed myself up to a sitting position, my hands like ice against the cold stone floor. My ears were ringing, and I clenched my eyes closed, only then realizing that what I was hearing was the music box's tune. It was vibrating off the walls around me, soft and muffled, as if it were coming from somewhere on the other side of the wall. Chains rattled, and I gasped, pushing myself against the stone wall behind me. My eyes searched the darkness but found nothing. I held my breath in an attempt to blend in with the darkness, but I couldn't hold it for long, and after a few seconds, gasped for air. The chains rattled again. You opened the box, didn't you? The voice came from all around me, hoarse and heavy, the voice of an old man too tired to speak. It sounded familiar, but I couldn't quite place it. My head snapped right and left, and my heartbeat quickened. Still, I couldn't see anything. That was stupid. The words felt like they were being whispered directly into my ear, and I scrambled away, blind to where I was going. A hand grabbed me by the shoulder, a vice-like grip that propelled me back against the wall as I screamed. My heart jumped into my throat and I kicked out aimlessly. Stop moving, the voice hissed. You'll only make it angrier. I felt tears sting my eyes as I rolled into a fetus position, pulling my knees as close to my chest as possible, trying to hide within myself. From around me, the tune from the music box grew louder, and the walls around me began to shake. I'm sorry, Johnny, the voice whispered. I couldn't stop it. I tried, but I couldn't. I froze, suddenly realizing who the voice belonged to. From somewhere far away, I heard screaming. You shouldn't have opened that music box, my grandfather said. I looked up, and twin eyes of deep amber burned in the darkness directly above my head. Claws dug into my back, forcing me to scream, and I was suddenly jerked up and propelled into the air. When I came to, I was lying on my bedroom floor. Someone was screaming, and the shrill sound of it pierced my ears and made me wince in pain. I tried to move, but all I could do was turn my head, the rest of my body numb and unresponsive. My father stood at the bedroom door, eyes wide and mouth agape as he stared at me in what looked like a mix of fear and confusion. On the floor beside him sat my mother, screaming while she rocked back and forth, blood staining the front of her shirt. She was cradling something in her arms, but my vision began to blur the instant I tried to focus on it, and I couldn't make out what it was. I blinked several times, and my head began to spin. I tried to speak but nothing came out, and I felt the world around me darken once more. The last thing I registered before I blacked out was my mother screaming Kevin's name. Entry 841, 20th of September, 2017. Patient number 3206, Jonathan Keller, supervising doctor, Dr. Henry Wilkins. Today's session with Johnny marks the last day for him at Lakevale, and it's a little ironic that I would have mixed feelings about this. As a doctor, a patient's positive progress and successful therapy should be celebrated, but I would be lying if I said I was happy to see him go. After 8 years of seeing him every day, I can't imagine what life without our sessions together will be like. It's hard to not try to figure out what is going on behind those piercing blue eyes of his. Nevertheless, the progress made has been one I am most proud of. During this past year alone he has shown a remarkable improvement in health, both mentally and physically. I've finally noticed some muscles on top of that lanky frame of his, and he's taken to actually combing his hair out of his eyes now. Some of the other doctors have even commented on how he has been helping other patients, as well as the nurses. He's come a long way from the quiet and lifeless boy that was brought through these doors 8 years ago. There is one concern I have about Johnny leaving the haven of Lakevale and joining the outside world. One which I believe should be properly addressed by the hospital before his release. The fact that his parents still refuse to answer our calls leaves the question open as to where he will go from here. It is obvious that, although Johnny has come to terms with killing his brother, his parents have not. I worry that the lack of a warm home will result in a relapse, not uncommon for patients like him. Nevertheless, I have high hopes for Johnny. It has been 2 years since he's mentioned the monster from the music box, or said anything about the coincidental death of his grandfather on the same day Kevin Keller died. He has even stopped drawing those hideous yellow eyes that plagued his artwork for years. I truly believe that Johnny will continue to show this kind of positive progress in the years to come. One thing I will not miss, though, is his sense of humor. Although it's a little too dark for my taste, some of the nurses assure me that it's going to help him fit in with today's society, and I can only hope that is true. Speaking of which, he left me a goodbye present today, something he made himself. I felt a little uneasy when I first saw it, but it did confirm that he has finally gotten over his fears. Besides, the craftsmanship is quite impressive. It's a music box with a little wolf on a disc.